I think the crux of the matter in spirituality hinges on the self. I think the meaning of life hinges on the self, and also the philosophy of life. That being on this planet, in a body as it were, is about self. So no matter what you know and what you do, it always revolves around yourself. If you have any form of experience that's ordinary and extraordinary, you have visions and synchronicities, you have meaningful relationships, you listen to music, you walk through nature, you read the sacred texts, you think about the philosophy and the mysticism and the literature and the poetry. It's you doing all of that. It's the self that's doing all of that, and each self is doing all of that. So from the very first human beings, everything's about yourself on this planet, on this earth. And each person finds meaning in whatever way they can. If they're born rich or poor, educated or not educated, people find meaning in what they do. They value what they do. I mean, if you say yes to life, then each day you build an idea of your life, you experience your life, and you try to find what's right for you and what's right for your relationships, whether it's with music or with other people, the place you live, the books you read. You're trying to do what's right. You're trying to find a balance. You're trying to find, you might say, an inner meaning, an essence in your relationship to the world and within yourself. So I would say that whatever you do in your life, including being interested in spiritual things, it's always about yourself. So you might say that self has to be there at the beginning and has to be there at the end. And in my estimation, self in essence is one. So it has to be one at the beginning, it has to be one at the end. So if you think of the beginning and the end of the human species, and the beginning and the end of the universe, and the beginning and the end of each individual life, then the one will be there at the beginning and at the end. So that would be the absolute principle. And I'm saying at the beginning and the end of your life, the self is there. You're born with yourself and you die with yourself. So you might say it has to be about self, and everything you are interested in your life, whether it's literature, other people, the place you're living, the sacred texts, the meaning of meditation, the meaning of metaphysics, it's all about yourself. So for me, self is not an issue. Self is what has to be there at the beginning of your life and at the end of your life. No matter what you do, whether it's spirituality or just living an ordinary life, it doesn't make any difference. And if you went into nirvana when you die, or you went to some other dimension or to another planet, wherever you go in the psyche, you will always be yourself. So really you could say, to self, it doesn't really matter. To self, it doesn't really matter whether you're interested in spirituality or not. To yourself, it doesn't really matter whether you meet this person or that person, or you read this book or that book, which means that to self, each self has the freedom to find out what life means for them in whatever way they can. So it really doesn't matter to self what you actually do, what you think, what you imagine, what path you follow, what interests you have. It doesn't really matter. What really matters is what you actually do with your life. And in terms of the idea of karma, is that you work on yourself, you work on your history, you work on your life, whether you live in this life only, or you've lived other lives on this planet, other planets, other dimensions, whatever. And you work to get things right. So I see karma per se as the human condition which we're all living in. So we're all living in the human condition, and the field of the human condition, the life of each person within the species on this planet, all of that is karma. So the world around you, nature, the physical universe, society, people, and inwardly in your psyche, in your dreams, in your visions, in your astral travel, all of that is karmic. Everything you do is karmic within your consciousness. And you have to find out, what is your karma? What is it that you need to understand? What is it that's being presented to you day by day? Why did you meet this person? Why did you live here? What's the meaning of that book? What's the meaning of that music? You work out where you stand in the world, what's right. So you could say that for each person, there's an overall pattern that your consciousness functions within. From the time you're born to the time you die, that karmic pattern is, you might say, invisible to the conscious mind, but it's there in reality. So no matter what you think you're doing, you're still working within that overall pattern. So whatever you think you can avoid, whatever you don't like and you're avoiding it, it will always be there. If you go from book to book, place to place, person to person, dream to dream, you will only see yourself reflected. And if you keep on avoiding what's presented to you, then you'll go around in circles. So really the point is, in any game, is you play the game. In order to comprehend the pattern, or the different patterns within the major pattern, you have to play the game. You have to go through the ritual. You have to go through the thought process. You have to feel what you're doing. You have to live it. You have to live through the drama. So if self is in a particular family, and the family is intellectual and they believe in education, then you take on the identity in your consciousness, the ego identity of being an educated person. So you're schooled to be an educated person. That's your identity. And that may be what you're fated to be within your karma. Now, whether you choose to be in the family you're born into, I don't know. But whatever it is, you're born into that pattern, and you have to find within that identity where you stand. So if you're brought up to be educated, when you go to university you have to decide what to do. So someone like Carl Jung, when he went to university, he wanted to become a doctor, so he studied medicine. And then it got to a stage where he switched to becoming a psychiatrist. Instead of being interested in the body, he became interested in the mind. So you could say he grew up thinking that he wanted to be a doctor, and then something came into his life and changed his mind. So he had to switch from one pattern to another, as it were. And that was under the influence of a particular book he read. So he read in a book something that affected him, and that changed his mind. It's like if you went to a concert and you heard some music that you've never heard before, and you just, it really means something to you, and you start listening to new kinds of music. So Carl Jung, in becoming a psychiatrist, became interested in mental illness. So he worked in a hospital for the mentally insane, as it were, a mental asylum in Switzerland. And various diagnoses of psychosis and neurosis and forms of schizophrenia, manic depression, all those things were in vogue. That's how they diagnosed people who were considered mentally ill, that couldn't function in society. They felt suicidal, and they were irrational, and they lived in fantasies, and they had delusions. And what he noticed was that within the people's lives that he studied, he basically found that what was happening in different people's minds was that they were symbolizing their experience. And as he studied the symbols, he realized that deep down in the psyche of each person were mythological processes that were common to the whole human race. And so that means that in the earliest peoples, the Aboriginal peoples, in dream time, they were dreaming in symbols and mythology, and all across the ancient world and the medieval world and the modern world, people dream in symbols. And those symbols are embedded in mythology. So you might say the earliest forms of mythology was magic, and then magic became religion. And what he said was that on the deepest level, what he called the collective unconscious, at the deepest level, that he said was part of the psyche, but actually in a different realm. The collective unconscious would remain unconscious. Consciousness and symbol and myth couldn't take you into the unconscious. You couldn't gain access to the unconscious. All you could receive from the unconscious were the projections of the archetypes. So in the collective unconscious, the archetypes are objective functions and perceptions of reality in the psychic and the physical world. Their perceptions that manifest in terms of symbols in the psyche and in the world. And how they manifest in the psyche and the world, in the dream and the everyday life, is through synchronicity. So if you have a synchronicity, for example, you have a dream about a particular bird, and then the next day you're reading a book, and in that chapter it mentions that particular bird. And within the story, within the book, that meaningful coincidence highlights something you need to know. So the archetype is creating the synchronicity to reveal the symbol to you that you need to know. And what I'm saying is, that is what karma is. Karma is produced by the archetypes. So the archetypes are objective to the physical and the psychical fields of experience, and the archetype is the overall patterning of karma. So you could say the archetype organizes the general field in which karma exists. So when I say there's a dominant field or pattern in a person's life, that's produced by the archetype. And throughout your life, the archetype will reveal to you important information and revelations and symbols that you need to know in order to work out your karma. And if you avoid your karma, then the archetype can't reveal to you what you need to know. So all forms of revelation, visions, magic, religion, dreams, astral travel, all the ways that you find meaning in your psyche and in the world around you is organized by the archetypes, and that works within a synchronistic field. So it unifies the inner and the outer. So what self does, well, in a sense, self does nothing. You yourself do nothing, but are aware of your consciousness and your body, and in your consciousness is the identity that you have as an educated person. The identity you have, maybe you specialize like Carl Jung in psychiatry, so that becomes his identity. Then he becomes a mythologist, and he becomes a therapist. And that identity is like his ego identity, which is at the center of his consciousness in terms of his karma. So in the karmic field, there will be a center identity. So every self in their consciousness will have a central identity that identifies you with what you need to know within the karmic structure. I mean, in my own life, quite a few things have been revealed to me to do with Egyptian magic, for example, and to do with the Grail legend and Tibetan Buddhism. So certain symbols, certain mythological gods and goddesses have been revealed to me, and they make up what would be called the mandala. So if you think of a symbolic mandala as a picture of your life, then you would say in the four corners and in the center are what they call the 5 orders of dhyani, the Buddhas of meditation. So as self, you, in a sense, you're in the state of meditation. The self as the one is meditating on life as a whole through the medium of consciousness. So you could say the mandala is a form of your consciousness, and what's revealed to you takes the form of a mandala. So in the 4 corners you have 4 aspects of the Buddha, and what's revealed to you, for example, in my own case, was the 3rd eye. That was one of the things that was revealed to me. Another one was the scarab. Another one was the rose. And another one was the unicorn. So the unicorn, scarab, rose, and 3rd eye, they were revealed to me. So you could say that the mandala was made up of those 4 symbols. And in the center, you could say, in the center is your self-nature, which means yourself is yourself, but it's reflected in your ego identity at the center of the mandala, and that's symbolized by a particular god like Buddha or Christ. So Christ could be in the center of a mandala, and so your mind symbolically is building a mandala, and the 4 corners represent integration. So it's the integration of, you might say, the four corners of the earth. If you think of the earth as a square, then the four corners of the earth are integrated. So symbolically, your mind or consciousness becomes integrated. And at the center is the God or Buddha, which represents wholeness, completion, perfection. And that would be a circle in the center. And that's in the visionary realm of the Sambhoga Kaya, where the Buddhas of meditation are. So when the self is meditating in life, in consciousness, you might say, is formed the archetypal projection from the spiritual dimension. And the spiritual dimension is where the spiritual perceptions of the Buddhas of meditation are, that make up the mandala. So, if, for example, you have revealed to you, say, the scarab, is in my own case, so I dream about the scarab, and I go in the museum and I see a scarab, and that becomes a meaningful coincidence. And then other things happen with the scarab that tell me that's a very important symbol to me. So as I think about the scarab, as I begin to integrate it in my life, through revelation, through synchronicity, through mythology, you might say, I'm trying to gain insight into the meaning of that symbol. And in order to get an insight into the meaning of the symbol, then I have to have a revelation. So you could say the revelation of the symbol synchronistically is the beginning of insight, and the insight is the spiritual perception of the Buddha of meditation. So you could say the self in meditation in the one has the spiritual perception that gives the self insight into the nature of the particular consciousness that is being symbolized. So in terms of the mandala, that would represent the pattern of your karma, which is taking place in your consciousness, which at the center is the ego identity. So you might say, as you grow up and you have an awakening in terms of a revelation or a synchronicity that puts you on the right path, then you begin to gain insight, and that's the opening of the third eye, what they call intuitive wisdom or Bodhic insight, enlightened insight. And that revelation is what Zen calls Satori. So the revelation of synchronicity, inwardly and outwardly, is a moment of Satori. When the third eye is open and you see through the veil, you see behind the veil the inner meaning and essence of the symbol. So you begin to attune to the spiritual dimension through the mandala, through the pattern in your actual life that's unfolding inwardly and outwardly. So you're gaining insight into your karma, into your consciousness, into the meaning of your life on this earth. And the idea is to move from the integration of the four corners into the center where things are made whole, things are made holy and one. So symbolically, the center is the one, and the center is the image of the Buddha with the third eye, which is the eye of meditation. And so when you've completed the mandala, that symbolizes the Sambhogakaya, the body of perfect endowment. So you perfected your spiritual body. You perfected that body. So self has spiritualized consciousness, spiritualized the meaning of life. So in a sense, you're living a spiritual life. And when you're living a spiritual life with the body of perfect endowment, then your attributes are compassion, love, understanding, truth, justice, all the higher virtues that consciousness, you might say, imitates. So ordinary consciousness is trying to be good, trying to be holy, trying to be one, trying to be integrated, trying to love, trying to find meaning. That's what we're doing when we're living our life. But when you begin the process of revelation and gaining insight into the nature of yourself, what they call the Buddha essence at the center of the mandala, then you're awakening the higher spiritual perceptions so that you gain insight into your relationship with the world through your consciousness, which is karmic. So you're healing the wound within your relationship, which is lacking in love. So in ordinary consciousness, you want to love, but you can't because you haven't awakened the spiritual perception of love. And once you have that awakened, that insight, then you can, in a sense, bring love into the relationship, which will heal the wound. And in the healing of the wound, you've integrated the division. So if you felt divided from somebody, then the healing of the world, the wound, is integration. And then when there's integration, when the duality of the wound is brought together and healed, then it's made whole, it's made holy. And therefore love can come into the relationship. But you've got to do the work on your karma, which is solved, as it were, by symbolic understanding, by insight. So you might say the process of integration, understanding and insight is a kind of liberation. You're liberating yourself from, you might say, the limited view of consciousness, which is egocentric, into a level of awareness where you're beginning to move into the field of the one, which is pure freedom and pure meditation. And you could say that meditation is a movement in freedom. So really karma ultimately is all that you know, all that you experience. And the essence of that larger pattern is the mandala. And the mandala symbolizes your spiritual nature. So your godlike nature, as in my case, the scarab is the god Kepra, the creator god. The rose is the goddess Venus. The third eye is the eye of the cobra goddess Kundalini. And the unicorn contains the third eye. At the base of the horn of the unicorn is the third eye. It's the same as the coat of arms. When people have coats of arms, then that actually is similar to the mandala. It belongs to the family tree. So in a sense it's your ancestral symbolic pattern, you might say. So in one sense, all through your life, the self, or yourself in essence, really isn't doing anything. It's simply that you're present within your life, within your body, within your psyche consciousness. You're simply present. And your consciousness, your ego identity, that works the way it works. So that when the child grows up, say it's 2 years old and it starts to learn the language, and it learns to speak, and it learns to read books,